What's up, guys? Alexander here, Date Psychology. So today we're going to do a little bit of celebrity gossip, right? Jonah Hill, pop psychology, and also I'm going to talk to you guys in general about the psychology of jealousy. So going forward, where should we start here? So in the media right now, going in circles, we have this situation with a celebrity named Jonah Hill and Sarah Brady, who was a surfer. They were dating about 1.5, 2 years ago, from what I can gather. Brady, as I mentioned, surfer, Instagram model. Jonah Hill, they broke up, right? He's dating someone else. He has a child with her now. And Sarah has gone on social media with some of his texts, right? The damning text messages that people tend to release in situations like this. So we can look at one of those. I'm not going to go through all of these texts because they're all online. So if you want to go through and look at these and decide for yourself, I'm not going to be super judgy here or tell you who's right or wrong or nitpick the text. I don't want to do that. It's not, my thing. But we will look at one. This is the main one that has been circulating to kind of get an idea of what we're going. This will kind of lay the foundation for a broader discussion of the psychology of jealousy. So here is a text that he sent, Jonah, to his ex-girlfriend. And it says, plain and simple, if you need surfing with men, boundaryless, inappropriate relationships with men, to model, to post pictures of yourself in a bathing suit, to post sexual pictures, and friendships with women who are in unstable places and from your wild recent past, beyond getting a lunch or coffee or something respectful. He says, I'm not the right partner for you. If these things bring you to a place of happiness, I support it, and there will be no hard feelings. These are my boundaries for romantic partnership, my boundaries with you based on the way these actions have hurt our trust. So this message has been very controversial because on the one hand, people look at it and they say, okay, that's kind of respectful, And then other people are saying, no, those are not actually boundaries. Boundaries mean something else. And they say boundaries mean something else. We'll get into that a little bit. So what can be said about this? We have, on the one hand, people are saying, okay, this is pretty respectful. He said, these are my boundaries. If you can't respect them, I'm happy for you. Go on and do your thing. And on the other hand, you have people that are saying, actually, this is extreme control, manipulation, and abuse. Why? Because he's asking her to make changes, right? And these are changes, some of these that are going to be pretty big, right? So she's a surfing instructor. She surfs with men, right? She can't just stop surfing with men, okay? She would have to basically quit her job. She's a model, so posting pictures on Instagram, is she going to be able to stop that? So on the one hand, it comes off across as very controlling, and on the other hand, people are saying, but he doesn't want to be in a relationship with someone that does this. And he's laying that out, and he's saying, you can change these or not. And there's other text messages floating around and all of that, but they all do kind of have this same tone to it. As far as breakups go, which can be pretty horrible, the way that people treat each other, and just like normally, right? Regular breakups, average breakups, people are horrible to one another. This is not super extreme, but for some reason it has captured attention as being something that is very extreme. So people have focused a lot on the photos here, like, well, are these inappropriate photos? And they pulled up photos where she's in almost a 1950s, like full bathing suit. And I don't think most people would find that inappropriate. Are there other photos? Maybe, but I think people are focusing too much on this photo issue, especially on social media, where people like to post photos of themselves, right? You have a cohort of individuals on social media. You're gonna get a lot of people who relate to that. Like, I post photos of myself on social media. So I think they might be missing something else that's going on here that he brought up kind of first in this list, right? Which was this inappropriate friendships with men. I think it's very likely, and we don't know much about this situation, right? We have a few text messages that she released, but I think there's probably something going on with that's contributing more to this. Now, we'll get into that in a discussion on jealousy, and I'll tell you why. But jealousy is usually, it involves a specific person, right? It's a form of mate guarding, right? A term from evolutionary psychology. That, you're trying to, you have a rival. It's usually a specific rival. And this is even the case with people that get jealous about photos and things. Someone likes their picture or whatever, and then that individual becomes the rival. So usually there's one kind of person that a jealous individual has in mind. Often when someone comes into therapy for jealousy, it's because there was a past affair or something like that. But in cases where there's not, or there's an ex still in the picture, or a friend that they're uncomfortable with, so usually there's a specific rival. And I think people are probably obsessing too much. Like, you can't ask her to stop surfing and posting the photos, but we don't know what else has gone on, right? We haven't heard from him. We haven't heard from more than a few texts. So we will look a little bit more. I read the text that he sent, right? He's talking about his boundaries. I'm not, these are my boundaries in a romantic partnership. And then you have a lot of people online, I've seen this, that say, that's actually not a boundary. Boundaries are only about you and what you'll accept. They're not about other people, right? Boundaries are not about what other people do. You can't say anything about other people's behavior. You can only say about yourself. Okay, so apparently this is popular. I think it's a meme. It's certainly nothing that I've seen in the literature on jealousy, okay? Nothing, never. But then again, therapy in psychology is very different from research psychology, right? It's very different from, the scientific method in psychology, where you're conducting studies and all of that. I don't know how well any of this is grounded in empirical literature. I don't know how evidence-based it is. I think it's probably not. A lot of this is like TikTok therapists, right? Is people, and this is, if someone calls themselves a therapist, that's not usually a regulated title, right? A lot of people just, I'm a therapist, and boom, they get 20,000 followers on Instagram and get a bunch of clients, and boom, they're a therapist. And some of them just make things completely up. And things that are popular drift into our pop psychology, right? Our folk psychology. What do we come to believe about human psychology in popular culture that may or may not be true, but that is a popular belief, right? Things like opposites attract is an example of a folk psychology that's probably not true, but whatever, examples like that. So I think this, that's not a boundary, whatever, that's kind of emerged in our folk psychology. We'll get into that a little bit. I'll show you in some of the literature. And like I said, there's not a lot. There's not actually a lot of literature on like clinical therapy explaining what people do. It's an entirely different field from what I do. So people have said as well, related to this, boundaries are not ultimatums, they're not demands, and so on, right? Basically, you can't request anything of a partner. You can't tell them what to do. That's not a boundary, that's something else. And they say, yeah, like I said, boundaries are only about your own behavior. Okay, some of this is just a definition game, right? Like, well, you're not using the term boundary, right? It doesn't matter, because we still want to ask, okay, let's not call it a boundary. Let's call it a demand, or an ultimatum, or a request, or a rule, or whatever. You can call it another rule, or a name, or whatever, and that's not going to change, like, if this is a good thing, if this is a bad thing, are you allowed to do that aloud, right, in a relationship? And that kind of a thing. So we'll look into that as well going forward. Boundaries, as far as I see them, and the way that I've seen them represented in the literature, they are in fact demands, okay? So particularly in system behavior therapy, jealousy is treated as dyadic, meaning that it's treated as a problem of the couple. It's not just like one person is jealous and you take them into therapy to be fixed, right? You go into therapy and they say, okay, why is this person jealous? What's going on with them? What's this other person doing to contribute to the jealousy, right? And a lot of people don't want to hear that, because some of that behavior might be totally innocuous, right? It might be totally innocent. Or it might be behavior that is kind of borderline, but that one person sees as innocent, right? And the other person doesn't, like posting bikini photographs or spending too much time with other men, other women, having a job at a bar in some of this literature where you're required to dance with people, something I did. And all of this is, these are things that contribute to jealousy, where someone might not actually have done something wrong, right? And I think a lot of people really struggle to get out of the mindset of thinking about like who's right, who's wrong. And so when they think about therapy, they think, okay, this guy's wrong, we're gonna take him into therapy and we're gonna fix him. And a lot of couples go to therapy and they immediately leave and they think he took her side, or the therapist took her side, the therapist took his side, or the therapist says something that they don't want to hear, because therapists will say, especially I believe, if you go to a clinical psychologist or something like that. I posted this on Twitter. I said, what would happen, you go to the therapist, you have this issue with photos online, and you're going through like, why does everyone feel this way? You get down the line, and eventually a question is going to come up that the therapist is going to ask the woman. He's going to say, how would you feel about taking the pictures down? Would you be willing to take the pictures down? And that's something that a lot of people do not want to hear, because they come with this belief that's like, but I should be allowed to post pictures. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay. But in a relationship, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong or whatever beliefs you have about posting pictures online. If you're upsetting your partner, you may have to make compromises, even with behavior that is like okay, right? To kind of reassure them. And that's another thing that people don't, I think, understand about therapy and about human psychology more broadly outside of therapy and relationships in general is that your partner can be unreasonable at times, and sometimes you kind of have to compromise a little bit for that. And we'll get into that reasonableness, okay? Because, you know, the requests here that Jonah has made of his girlfriend, who's a surfer and a model and all of that, it's basically like giving her whole life up. So are these reasonable? You know, we'll get into that. You know, maybe not. They're probably not especially reasonable, and it's not surprising that, you know, they broke up over this, because that's a lot to give up. But the point is, boundaries do impose demands on individuals, right? They do impose demands about changing the behavior of another person. Typically, you know, they are expressed kind of like, this is a limit for me, and if you continue to do this, then the relationship's going to end. And it doesn't matter how you express that, okay? You know, there's probably, well, I say that, but there's better ways to express it than not. You could say, you know, this is too much for me. If this continues, I'm not going to be able to do it. Or you could say, you need to change, or I'm going to break up with you. You're saying the same thing. It's, you know, the message is exactly the same. What's different is how you phrased it. That's it, okay? The person is still put in the position of deciding, do I change the behavior, or do I leave? Or do I let this person break up with me? You know, that sort of a thing. Let's go on to the next. Here's an example from this paper, because you know, there's so much of this "it's not boundaries" discourse online that, you know, I'm sick of it. And here's a paper that kind of looks at how a therapist would recommend boundaries in the case of couples that came in for jealousy, and I think it might surprise some of you guys. So there was different case studies within this, different vignettes that they described. This was one from a couple, they called them Karen and Carl. He said, Karen's liberal attitudes about outside relationships no longer held when asked to define boundaries that would apply to both spouses as opposed to her alone. So I can't just go through all of the paper, but in this paper, these two couples were asked to create a contract of behavior, okay, about what behaviors they would be allowed to do, both of them, and not. So you're seeing boundaries imposed upon the relationship. It's not just one person saying, I'm not going to be able to handle it. Here we see the second part of this. I'll read it to you. By defining relationship boundaries, Carl asserted the conditions under which he would terminate the marriage. So you basically have an ultimatum written into this contract that the therapist recommended that says, if these things are violated, then the relationship's over, okay? So it's not the case that ultimatums don't exist in relationships. You can call them boundaries or whatever you want. People have deal breakers, right? They have boundaries, they have rules. And they tell their partners, you know, if you don't do this, I'm out. And it might seem really unreasonable if it's like, hey, if you don't quit your job, I'm out. It might seem more reasonable if you say, hey, you need to stop using drugs, or I'm out, right? Or you need to stop playing video games all day, or I'm out. Or you need to get a job, or I'm out. Or, you know, you need to clean around the house, or I'm out. Or whatever the case may be, okay? People tell their partners things like this all the time. It's a normal feature of relationships, completely normal. Boundaries in this thing. So what else did the therapist do? Karen had a curfew, okay, at 1 a.m. So this was someone that worked at a bar and then would stay kind of for the after parties at the bar. They said, you can't do that anymore. You got to come home after that. Was she doing anything wrong by doing that? In a moral sense, no. But this is one of those things that's going to throw a lot of people, that you go into therapy and maybe they're not going to say, yeah, you go, girl, you just do whatever you want. They're going to say, can you not make compromises for the relationship in a sense, okay? Can you not kind of settle down a little bit? And again, you know, does this apply to the Jonah? I don't know, but giving you examples here of what might actually occur. And people, you know, they go to therapists and they get mad because the therapist tells them something that they don't want to hear, and they say, you know, he's a misogynist, he took his side, or it's a feminist, took her side, or whatever the case may be. So, like I said, they drafted a marital contract, right? And this was actually pretty strict. Neither party could plan events with the opposite sex. They couldn't go out with the opposite sex, whatever. Carl set some ultimatums for divorce. Apparently he didn't have those before, right? Apparently the other Karen or whatever thought she could do whatever she wanted, and he would just kind of hang around. And that was a problem, okay? Because there was no limit that was like, hey, you have to pick between these behaviors and the relationship. So if this surprises you, maybe you have been watching too many therapists on TikTok. All right, maybe you should hit the literature, right, and see some of these case studies. This is actually quite common that, you know, you'll go into therapy and they'll say, yeah, you got to change something. Boundaries. Here, again, a different paper, right? This is called Disarming Jealousy in Couples Relationships. So yesterday I read through a bunch of papers on treatments, you know, interventions for for couples experiencing jealousy. Let's go on. I'm going to read some quotations from this. Individuals vary a great deal about what they consider optimal boundaries in their relationship. While some expect strict borders regarding outsiders, others believe that openness to many people is essential to them. So there's not just one way to do it, right? You won't go to a therapist and he's going to say, oh no, you should totally be polyamorous or something, right? You have to accept them hanging out with friends. There's an incongruence in boundaries, and that's what leads to a lot of jealousy. We will talk about that as well. When one person says, yeah, I want to have a bunch of friends. I want to have a bunch of male friends. I want to have a bunch of female friends. And the other person's like, I'm really uncomfortable with this. That might be something that you can never even reconcile. And when the couple is having conflict over this, it's likely they're going to go to a point where someone tries to impose some control, right? That's the top reason, according to the research that I read, or the top strategy for dealing with jealousy when couples come in to therapy is some kind of control was imposed. Men and women do this both. It's not just one-sided. Next quote here. To consider themselves a couple, two people must establish boundaries around their union that will differentiate their relationship from all others. So this is really what boundaries are in this dyadic approach. Okay, boundaries are not just what one person's going to accept and the other person gets to do whatever they want. Boundaries are how the couple behaves in agreement, the rules that they have set for one another and agreed upon, okay? They're very much an imposition upon the behavior of the other person. Entering a relationship, settling down, having a long-term relationship, you typically do have to give up behavior, you know? That's probably why we see a big decline in friendship groups and size with age. By the time people get to their 30s, mid-30s, a lot of them don't have any friends, okay? And that's actually a normal pattern of I guess, interpersonal interaction that has existed for decades and decades. Why? Because people go to work a lot, they're outside of those groups, and all of their friends are married, and they're married. Their best friend is now their wife, basically, right? At least the person they spend all of their time with, the person they are closest to in that sense. And that's what it is, that's what it becomes. If you continue kind of with these adolescent patterns of interpersonal behavior into adulthood, that can be a problem. You know, you have one person, for example, that's like, I just would like to have a wife or a husband. I want to spend most of my time with them and do things together. But this person has like a billion friends and wants to go out partying yeah, you're going to have a problem, okay? You're going to have jealousy that arises, not because either one of them are wrong, but because they're very incongruent in their expectations and goals for the relationship, but also for the other person, right? Because, yeah, boundaries do exist around the other person. Next quote here. Couples must also define boundaries in terms of how much they influence and interference, how much influence and interference they will tolerate from parents, in-laws, children, ex-spouses, friends, work, computers, smartphones. Yeah. So again, you know, your boundaries are very much what will I tolerate as far as impositions, right? From these outside factors. It's not just all about like you. It's very much about what is going on with other individuals. And that doesn't mean that boundaries mean like you can tell them to change, okay? I think that's why kind of a lot of people didn't like the messages, is because they thought, oh, he's controlling her, he's trying to tell her to change. But boundaries are things that happen that say, okay, you know, if this doesn't change, I'm out. If you don't change, I'm out. I'm out because it didn't change, whatever the case may be, right? And that can very much be like, I don't like your friends, okay? I don't like that you're hanging out with too many men or too many women. I don't like that you still talk to an ex, you know. I don't like that you work 60 hours a week. I don't like that you spend all day on the computer. All of these things are boundaries. And they're very much about the behavior, yeah, of the other person. It's not just like, what am I going to do anyway? Great. So next slide here. This is something that comes up a lot in this discourse. But she's a surfer, right? Okay, I've already said it. You have someone that's a surfer. You know, her job is surfing with a bunch of guys. I guess that's the surf culture. There's some discussion of that in these messages, that this is kind of a special culture. So the idea is, but she's a surfer. You got into a relationship with her. How could you expect her to change? Let me try and remember a quote from the last paper. I had it in a different slide. But it was basically that boundaries must constantly be renegotiated in a relationship, right? People change their minds. It's that simple, okay? You can set any rules that you want in a relationship. You can change them, you can change your mind. There's no cosmic law against this, and that is actually how relationships work in practice. People can ask you to change, even if their demands are unreasonable, right? They can break up with you if you don't. They can break up with you even if you do. And if your lifestyle does not make them comfortable, they can break up with you for that. And they can ask you to change your entire lifestyle, which will probably usually be an unreasonable demand. Most people aren't going to do it. Most people aren't capable of doing it. They probably don't want to if they're living that lifestyle. They'll probably resent you if you do make them change their whole lifestyle for you. You know, they'll probably look back and think like, I gave up my career for you or something like that. So it's not good to do. I'm not taking a side here and saying like, hey, this is good what he did. It probably wouldn't have worked out no matter, if she gave everything up, and it wouldn't have been a good outcome, I don't think, regardless. But that's the point, is people can ask you, can you be mad about it? I mean, it's normal to feel bad about it, but did they break some law? No, not really. It's not fair. Okay, I understand. It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't have to be. Nothing in relationships have ever been fair. People, they think about like right and wrong. It doesn't help you much to understand relationships, framing it through that point of view. And what these demands do is they put the ball in the court of the other person. They say, okay, here are the demands. You can change or not. And that's it. And there's nothing more you can do from that point. What would you do? Force him to stay with her in this lifestyle that he makes him extremely uncomfortable? You can't do that, right? You're going to take him to therapy, right, to change him, right? Well, we've already kind of covered that that's not what therapy does, okay? And we'll go into that a little bit more, but it's really difficult to change jealous people at all. Most of these relationships with extreme jealousy, like really extreme, they don't make it. So, yeah, this idea that, well, he can work on himself and that's not realistic at all. That's again, part of our folk psychology. It's a perception that people have about therapy, like, oh, I'm going to work on my jealousy, and now I'm going to totally accept this, polygamous relationship, or I'm going to accept all of your photos online, or I'm going to accept all of your female friends that you spend all week with. It's not going to work in the vast majority of cases. So something else to consider here, okay? This whole picture, I'm going to read a quote from another paper here. It says, the therapist usually enters a twilight zone about what is fantasy and what is reality, what are facts and what are projected fears. This is another paper on treating jealousy in couples. And why? Because you have two couples, or actually you have a couple that comes into therapy. He tells one side of the story. He says, she's talking to all of these men, she's posting all of these risky photos, and she's over here like, I haven't done anything wrong. This is perfectly innocent. I haven't cheated. And he's like, I'm sure she's cheated. And she's like, I haven't. How do you know it's real? You don't. And in the case of, someone going online and posting these like 5 messages that are not even that extreme, it's kind of like, do you even know what's going on? Do we know that, people curate their reputation, right? Reputation management. Do we know that these are probably the worst things that he has said, if that's what she's released? And that should tell you something, that, if these are the very worst that she could find, the rest of the discussions were probably pretty calm. He hasn't released anything, so we don't know anything about how she might have behaved. He said inappropriate relationship with friends. Do we know anything about those relationships? No. And that's something else, in these papers that I've read on therapy for jealous couples. It's not always the case. Very often it is not the case that it's just some like unreasonable jealous dude. A lot of the time, people are engaging in behaviors that would make most people jealous and upset, okay? And then they're asked to change those behaviors, and then they get kind of upset about that, or they don't comply. But given that we do not know what these, so-called inappropriate relationships with male friends were, is she going out all night and not coming home? Is she going out and doing cocaine with them? Are they hugging each other in the water when I don't know. No one knows. And that's the point, is it's one thing, from a kind of an activist point of view online, like I'm advocating for the rights, whatever. It's another if you take it from, the perspective of kind of a neutral psychologist, and you say, without hearing both stories, you don't know. You can say believe her or whatever, but, the evidence, you got to look at it. So, yeah, like I said, I'm not going to go into this whole Jonah Hill thing in great detail, but I wanted to kind of set the stage for a broader discussion of the psychology of jealousy generously. I'm going to go over different things about jealousy here. So, why do we experience jealousy at all? It's, a pair bonding mechanism. It's observed in all mammals. I believe most, I don't know, say all, every single one, I don't know. But many mammals, in other apes, certainly. It's most likely evolved to facilitate the maintenance of pair bonds, right? Why? when you feel jealousy, right, it's closely related to other emotions like love and anger and that sort of thing as well. It makes you want to be closer to someone. It also makes you engage in behaviors that are called mate guarding, right? Which is kind of what we saw in the Jonah Hill example. What's an example of mate guarding? Saying you can't hang out with those people. Who is this? Who are you talking to? All of that. Mate guarding, of course, would facilitate keeping a partner away from other mates. And that might not seem the case in a modern environment, in which case we might have a sort of evolutionary mismatch, right? What worked in an ancestral environment, you know, you could physically maybe keep a mate from another person, you could kill the rival mate or whatever. It's probably not going to work, you know, in 2023 and in Hollywood or whatever the case may be. If you do that, you're probably just going to push someone away. So it might be counterproductive. But those are probably the, you know, evolutionary origins of jealousy. That it facilitates pair bonding, okay? There are some sex differences in jealousy, but really not a lot, okay? A lot of the discussion has been on, you know, like, he's such a small man, jealous man, men are all like this. You know, men and women experience jealousy at very similar rates to a similar magnitude. I think some research indicates women may be a little bit more jealous. There's been research that indicates women experience more jealousy for different things, and men experience more jealousy for different things. Classically, you know, what is kind of filtered into the mainstream is, okay, women are more jealous over emotional infidelity, men are more jealous over sexual infidelity. So is that always the case? No, it's not. So first off, men and women both get very jealous over both of these, okay? So don't think like, you know, if you're a woman, like, yeah, I can, well, whatever, you know, these will both make people jealous, even if there are average differences, you know, but you're still gonna get high scores for both. And if you vary the condition, then you can start to see those sex differences narrow. So it can also be a factor of the experimental condition. The point is, you know, it's not something that we see just expressed in men, okay? Even though a lot of the discussion seems to think like, oh, insecure men, very jealous. Yeah, some. Insecure women, very jealous too. Jealousy is a very fundamental human emotion. It's not something that most people do not experience, okay? Why are there some subtle sex differences in the experience of jealousy? So, as I mentioned, jealousy is a function of mate retention, right? It can make you draw closer to a partner. It can make you kind of force that partner to be closer to you, at least, you know, in an ancestral environment. If that works now, probably, you know, you might want to find another strategy. Mate guarding, right? But why do they experience differences in something like emotional and sexual jealousy? Well, men may have needed more parental certainty, right? Maybe you don't want to invest resources in offspring that is not yours. And this is not something like a conscious decision, right? That's something that would have evolved to facilitate the propagation on a gene level. It's not like men need to know consciously. That's something that would have developed much, much earlier. And we see that again in many animals, right? If the animal, you know, it will reject babies, that sort of thing, that are not closely related to it. Even, I believe, in some birds. Because birds, it used to be believed that birds were very monogamous. Now we see that birds actually engage in a lot of extra pair parenting. And I think there has been cases where they also engage in co-parenting, many birds. So I think there, and I would have to look this up again, cases where a male bird is more likely to reject from the nest offspring that it is not genetically related to. So this is not conscious, right? This is something that's going on. I don't think it's totally understood how, but whatever. That might be why sexual jealousy is more common in men. Parental certainty. What about women? From, you know, sexual strategies theory, parental investment theory, that sort of thing, kind of providing the foundation here. Women may need more certainty about commitment and resource provisioning, right? So if a man has sex with another person, right, and that's it, does that threaten his pair bond with her and his ability to provide resources? Maybe not as much, right? But if he's emotionally invested in another person, he might leave the relationship, right? And that does. So maybe that's why women experience a little bit more emotional jealousy. And people say stuff like, or see stuff like this, you know, manosphere, whatever, and they really take it out of context. They're like, okay, well, does that mean that men can just cheat and women don't care? I mean, try it for yourself in your own relationship. See what happens. They care. People, you know, men and women both are going to get really upset for whatever kind of infidelity or jealousy is going on. So keep that in mind. Jealousy, it's not always bad. This is important, and it's something that people get very wrong in, again, in our folk psychology, popular psychology. Jealousy is seen as pathological. It's not. Jealousy is not a pathological thing. It has functions in relationships, not simply mate guarding, and keeping away from mates, but in healthy couples, jealousy can draw couples together, right? They can kind of lean on one another when they're able to express feelings, when they're able to express their jealousy and they receive kind of a reciprocal response, and many couples are not able to do this. And this is where you get another problem, is when you have a jealous person and he's reaching for support because he's jealous or something like that, and the other person pulls away, then you get in a cycle that I've seen called the aversive cycle. In this aversive cycle, what happens is one person will feel jealousy. They will approach the other person, often with controlling behavior, but maybe even seeking support, whatever the case may be, and that will kind of push the other person away. The other person will distance. And what happens when they distance? The jealous person is going to become even more jealous. They're going to behave in that way even more. Then what's going to happen? They're going to distance more. They're going to engage in more of the same behavior. And so you get in this cycle that's very, very destructive. And what I read in some of these papers on interventions is they can be kind of different from other interventions in psychology, where you're kind of guiding people to gradually work through a process, where they can be more abrupt, where it's kind of like, okay, both of you guys kind of have to stop now, and here are some very specific behaviors that you need to engage in, like you need to take the photos down, for example, or maybe you should actually stop hanging out with these people, and you need to stop calling her all day long, things like that. So that can be a maladaptive manifestation of jealousy, but that's not always the case, right? Control in a relationship, not always bad. You can't control me, whatever. That's a belief in our folk psychology that people have. Extreme control is probably very bad, and you get to a point where people talk about like abusive control, that sort of a thing. But people tell their partners, what they can and can't do all the time. And it's not always abusive or bad. It's a way that people express expectations for behavior. So what else? People give up their freedoms in relationships. And the paper that I went over discusses this as well. So relationships are basically a freedom, security trade-off, okay? And what does that mean? That you have the security of a monogamous partner, of someone that you can rely on, and that is not going to cross your boundaries, but only if you meet their expectations as well. And in that case, you trade freedoms that you had, like going out every night and having sex with other people, whatever, posting online. This is going to vary relationship to relationship, right? It's not the same for all relationships. Some people, they don't care. If you post pictures online, there's people that don't care, about anything, and there's people that are very restrictive. And we will get into that in a second as well. Aversive cycle, I mentioned this. So problems occur when you have an incongruence of boundaries, and this is what I was about to say, is that there's a big spectrum of what people will tolerate and expect in relationships. And it's not that one is wrong and one is right. It's that people are imbalanced and unmatched here. So you have an incongruence of boundaries. You have someone that, wants to have a bunch of male friends, and they like to cuddle with their female friends in bed or whatever, and they like to not come home at night. And then you have someone else that's like, okay, I'm from the Amish country, and I think that you should never show your legs in a skirt. And you get these two people together, you're going to have a big problem, okay? And if one tries to change the other, it's not going to work either. So one partner chases, trying to change them, the other pulls away, and they end up in therapy, or they break up or whatever. And the relationship was doomed from the beginning. And people are saying a lot online, they're saying, well, Jonah should have known. Yeah, he should have known, It was obvious from the beginning that if you go into someone's life and they have this entire lifestyle, you're not going to expect them to change their entire lifestyle for you, But at the same time, that's what people do, guys. That's exactly what people do. People will date a stripper and then be like, hey, why don't you stop stripping? And you can blame them and say, oh, that doesn't make sense. You should have known better. Okay, yeah, maybe. But that doesn't mean that's not what people do when the rubber hits the road and the person is actually in the relationship. Maybe they thought it was going to be cool and they could handle it. And then they're experiencing it, right? They're experiencing it at that time. And they're saying, ooh, I thought I would be okay with this, but now that I'm like living through it, I'm not, is what they say. And then they say, okay, I can't be in this anymore, or it's got to change. One of the two. And often they'll try to ask the person to change first. So there are other reasons that this incongruence of boundaries happens, that people can't just predict it ahead of time. You can't just say, you should have known, because you can't always know, okay? He should have known that she was a surfer that posts surfing pictures on Instagram, right? That's obvious, and expecting her to take those down later, okay. But did he know what her relationships with her male friends were like, right? And we don't know what those are like either, you know. Did he know how much time she was spending at home, how she interacted specifically with other people, how much time she spent doing other activities? None of those things are going to be known until you get in a relationship with someone. The guy, you know, who dates a stripper. He goes to a strip club, he dates a stripper, and he says, oh, this is really cool. And then he finds out, you know, like he's sitting at home every single night, you know, from 8 o'clock to 5 in the morning, and she's out stripping. And then he says, well, I didn't expect that. Should he have expected that? Probably. But expectation is different from experience, you know. People aren't very smart all of the time. They don't always know these things until they experience it. And then what do you do? Just blame them and say, well, you're dumb, you should have known better. Yeah, okay, they're dumb, and they should have known better. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to make demands or break up for it. Social media use and jealousy. There's a lot of research on this. In fact, there's way more research on this than anything about therapy related to jealousy. I don't know what's going on with therapy, if they just make things up or what they do, but whatever. So social media use really robustly associated with relationship problems. Incredible. And I didn't expect to find this either. I had never really looked into it that much. Particularly stemming from jealousy. Why is that? Well, you know, how recent in human evolutionary history have we had social media, which lets anyone upload a bunch of photos, get a bunch of attention, huge potential mate pool. You know, you have people messaging and talking in secret, all of that, an ability to find new mates. It wasn't that closely associated with actual infidelity, perhaps surprisingly, but it was associated with a lot of relationship problems, jealousy, lower relationship satisfaction, and all of that. And that raises another question, you know, because you have a lot of people that approach this from a very idealistic point of view. What should be as opposed to what is. The way that people actually feel is what is. What should be is like, I should be able to post any picture I want. Okay, let's say you should. That's not going to change this, right? That it's going to upset at least some people. And that's going to impact some of your relationships. So again, you know, if you want to post a bunch of pictures online, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Some people are not going to be right for you in a relationship if you do, and some people will. And you might find that it leads to some problems. Okay, related to this kind of idealistic perception of relationships, right? We have very new social norms that are really actually represented in a minority, and you could call these the woke or whatever, you know. And then we have 2 million years of hominid evolution at the same time. Which of those do you expect to win, to shape relationships more? These social norms that we learned that most people don't even actually ascribe to, or emotions that we have evolved with, right? I think the emotions are going to win most of the time. A lot of the recent norms for what people should tolerate in a relationship, and I can give examples of these, like people who say you should never get divorced. That's one, and that's not even that recent, right? It's recent in human evolutionary history. It's not recent in, I guess, the span of a human life, right? It's something that we have all experienced within our lifetime for many thousands of years. But people who say, you know, you should never get divorced. It's a contract. Okay, great. So you set up this rule. Does that change the fact that the human predominant mating pattern is serial monogamy? That most people don't stay in the same relationship. Most people eventually fall out of love, or the love changes, right? Sternberg's theory of love, it changes from passionate love to something else, right? Does that stop people, you know, that you signed a marriage contract from meeting someone else and falling in love with them? No, it doesn't stop any of that, right? Evolution doesn't care about divorce. It doesn't. It simply does not. And the same is true if you talk about something like monogamy, right? There's people that say monogamy is a social construct. We wouldn't be monogamous if people didn't make us be monogamous. That's probably not true. You know, if you talk about lifelong monogamy, yeah, maybe, you know, marriage, like I said. If you talk about serial monogamy, the fact that people prefer to bond with one person, they get jealous against rivals, they want that person to be loyal to them, right? They're typically not actually having a lot of affairs, even, when not married, that sort of a thing. Not having a lot of casual sex outside, that's not something that we invented as a social norm. That's simply what people do when you let them, okay? So yeah, the idea that like monogamy is made up or that marriage should exist forever, these are norms that don't always kind of go well with the reality of human psychology. What else? People's stated beliefs and preferences also often don't match their actual feelings and their relationship behavior. So what does that mean? People will say that they want a certain kind of behavior in a partner, and then that might not be what they actually pick. Okay, so I've run collected a recent data set on what was this? The construct of the ambivalent sexism inventory. It has two facets: benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. And I gave this poll to a lot of people, and I asked them about feminist identification. So if you ask a lot of feminists, about sexism, and this benevolent sexism inventory is kind of a product of feminist psychology, right? Feminist strains of thought. And so, of course, benevolent sexism is supposed to be bad. But what is it? It's kind of like chivalrous attitudes, right? It's kind of like traditionally conservative attitudes and beliefs toward gender roles. In a vignette that I made that was based entirely on those items, there's just like benevolent sexism as a person, even that was desired highly by feminists. So you might see someone say on paper, like, yeah, this is sexist, I don't like it. But then when it comes like, oh, a man actually behaving that way, maybe they do. And I've written another review on Aporia, a big review of the literature. If you guys look there, Aporia magazine, it's called Rethinking Benevolent Sexism. And again, a bunch of research shows that it's associated with higher relationship quality. And then it's even, again, there's past research that said, yeah, even women that lean more egalitarian feminist still seem to be pretty attracted to it. So you might have people that say, like, I don't want sexist attitudes. And then they're kind of attracted to at least some of them, right? The benevolent ones, not the hostile ones. Those, boom, way down. Another example would be people that are like, I should be able to do whatever I want. You should be able to do whatever you want, right? Maybe that's a better way to put it. You should be able to do whatever you want. And then the partner goes out and does whatever they want. And then they say, actually, now that you're doing whatever you want, I don't think I like it very much. It doesn't feel very good. And where do you see this? In kind of polyamorous couples, some of them, usually there is a asymmetry in jealousy where one of them is less jealous and one of them really struggles with it. And if you look at kind of like, I guess pop culture, polyamory, TikTok therapy or whatever, you will see that a lot of this discourse is all around like, how do I deal with my jealousy in this, right? So you have people that are like, yeah, I want to do this. They enter and it's like, now I feel terrible. Okay, and they're trying to reconcile this because they have a belief, a conscious belief, an ideological belief that's incongruent with the way that they actually feel, in their emotions, in their biochemistry, right? In their heart or their soul or whatever the case may be. And yeah, that's another example kind of a mismatch, right? Between beliefs, explicitly what you might like to believe, and how you really feel. Your lifestyle will influence jealousy, okay? So, like I said, we pathologize jealousy. We act like it's really crazy and irrational, and everyone that is jealous is problematic. They need to work on themselves, sweetie. So, is that really the case? No. Often jealous people are actually quite reasonable in the research. Most of the research on jealousy and couples going into couple therapy, all of these case studies that I read, the therapist acknowledged like, hey, this person is actually doing something to make the other person jealous. And it wasn't always infidelity. Sometimes it was. But it was often things that I think would make many people uncomfortable. So jealous people are often actually quite reasonable. It's not just the case that they're being irrationally jealous. In the case of, Jonah, was he, I'm going to let you decide for yourself. But it's often the case, more broadly, that they're not. And a really bad way to respond to this, but a way, again, that people think, that I would also say has emerged kind of in our folk psychology, is this attitude like, I can do whatever I want and they should just cope. Okay, they're not going to cope, guys. They're not going to change. You're not going to get them into therapy, and the therapy's not going to be like, wow, you're so problematic. You need to change your jealousy. It's not going to happen. Even if they try, it's probably not going to work. This is something that's very ingrained in individuals. It's, personality traits even kind of enhance jealousy. It's very stable over the lifetime. But that also means individuals kind of need to look at their own behaviors, their own lifestyles to see if that invokes jealousy. For example, let's say that you are a club promoter, right? You're going out every night with 4 in the morning and you're spending a lot of time with a lot of other women. So, and I can give you an example, I guess, from my own life. So I was a dancer, salsa and bachata, and one thing they do is they bring you out kind of as a taxi, right? They ask you to come to the clubs and come to the dance schools if you, and why do they do that? Because there's an imbalance of men and women. So if there's guys that can dance kind of well and they think, reasonably looking dude, they will call and you're like, they call it a taxi. You're like a guy that comes to the club to dance with all the people. So for some people, they won't care, but some people will, if my lifestyle were, okay, so I'm going out, most nights of the week and I'm staying dancing between, 3, 4 in the morning or whatever till the club closes with a bunch of other women. Some people are going to be very uncomfortable with that, right? Some women would be very, very uncomfortable with that. If there's a woman who was a dancer or something, she probably wouldn't. She might understand that culture a little bit more, but that's not the case for everyone, right? And so your lifestyle would interfere with some relationships. And it would be because of your behavior, even though your behavior is not wrong, right? Because it's not an environment, you're dancing with people, you're not having sex with them or whatever. It's not an environment where you're doing anything wrong. But it is an environment that can kind of raise eyebrows for some people, right? Where some people are going to look at that and say, hey, I'm not really comfortable with, my boyfriend going out and spending all night dancing with a bunch of other women. So your behavior, your lifestyle can impair your relationships, even if you've done nothing wrong. And that might mean that it comes a point in your life where you have to decide, like between a lifestyle, between a relationship, or simply find people who are kind of congruent with that, which will, it will shrink your mate pool a little bit, right? It will shrink the number of people because not everyone's going to like it. But yeah, there you go. People have different tolerance for jealousy, right? And this is going to vary by the relationship and the individual. A big problem I see online is people also kind of pathologizing the lower tolerance that a lot of people have. Okay, so you have people that are very unrestricted sexually, maybe very high sociosexuality or whatever, the very low jealousy in that case, and they think it's fun to flirt with other people, and they think their partner shouldn't mind. They want to have a bunch of attention from people online or something like that. And then if someone else is like, I would prefer if you didn't speak to a lot of people online. I would prefer if you did not post those pictures of yourself. They'll say, oh, that's so problematic. You're controlling me. You have a problem. That's not a problem. That's just a difference in values and beliefs. People don't have a problem just because they expect more conservative behavior in a relationship, right? These expectations are completely normal. They fall on a spectrum. They're not oppressive. They're simply differences, individual differences. It's only a mismatch of expectations. And what can you do when you encounter that in a relationship? Well, you can change your behavior, which might not be reasonable or something that you want to do. No one's telling you like you have to. Or you can leave and you can find someone else. But what you probably can't do is to change the other person and tell them, you need to change your jealousy. And that might raise a question. You might say, oh, but you're saying I could change my behavior. Why can't I tell the other person to change? Because behavior is really easy to change, specific concrete behaviors. If someone said, don't go out dancing every night, I could do that. That's something that you could do. If someone said, I want you to stop feeling jealous. I want you to stop thinking about the pink elephant. Do not visualize the pink elephant. You're going to have trouble with that, okay? You don't have the kind of control over feelings and beliefs that you do over specific actions, right? And as far as changing specific actions, you might not want to. If I dated a girl and she was like, you can't go out dancing anymore. You gotta cut it out. I would probably think like, maybe this isn't for me exactly. But then again, maybe you would get to a point where you are in love with that person, and then that activity or whatever is also not that important for you, right? You might think like, oh, maybe I can bring her dancing, and not go out by myself. You can come up with kind of compromises where you do modify your behavior, but that you don't have to toss it in the trash can, right? And this is something else that therapists help people come up with. That again, it's not just saying, well, jealous person, you need to fix your jealousy, sweetie. It's not like that at all. No, you got to come to a compromise that brings the two people together in that sense. And for that, the people have to reach toward one another. Good couples, they do this. They reach toward one another. They do it spontaneously, okay? And they modify their own behavior spontaneously. What does that mean? So first off, what the couples that don't struggle with a lot of jealousy, they begin with pretty congruent expectations, right? So you have, a man and a woman, and they think, I don't think it's good to post, revealing pictures online. And she believes that, and he believes that. Boom. You're probably not going to have a big problem with that at the beginning. You have a couple that's like, okay, I'm an Instagram thirst trap model, and then you have a guy that's more conservative, and they get into a relationship somehow. Yeah, you're going to have a problem there because you began with very incongruent beliefs. Okay, but what else do good couples do very spontaneously? And I think many people don't do this or even think about it. They modify their own behavior spontaneously in a way that avoids partner jealousy, and they do that ahead of time. They think, I should not do this because it would look bad to my partner, right? And a lot of people are going to be completely incapable, I think, of relating to that. A lot of people, I think, are actually, they struggle to even kind of put themselves in the position of another, and that's related to skills like theory of mind, for example, right? To cognitive and emotional empathy as well. And there's individual differences here. Not everyone is good at that. A lot of people, if something does not feel bad to them, it's really difficult for them to even understand why it might feel bad to another person. And so they're going to have a really hard time thinking like, okay, going out dancing with other women doesn't feel bad to me, but it might feel bad to another person. Okay? They won't even be able to get to that point to imagine that, right? They won't even be able to think like, just because it doesn't feel bad to me, it might actually still feel bad to the other person. So this is something that emotionally intelligent couples, good couples, do well ahead of time to avoid problems, right? They usually do this well before the jealousy occurs, before they engage kind of in that behavior. They really value the feelings of an emotional partner, right? They think about how they feel. They empathize with them, and that makes them avoid certain behaviors, and it doesn't mean change your whole life, like in the Jonah case. That's not what I'm saying. Just small things that come up, day-to-day life, the way that people act. They don't have an attitude of, it's your problem, you need to fix it, right? They realize that any problem that is the other person's problem, yeah, you're in a relationship, it's your problem now too. So rarely is it just the other person. In reality, and from many of these therapeutic models and perspectives as well. Again, remember, it's a dyadic problem. The problem is the couple's problem. It's not just crazy jealous dude's problem. Bad couples, what do they do with their jealousy instead? Well, they have very incongruent expectations and behaviors to begin with. And then importantly, they're unwilling to change those behaviors. And that doesn't mean, they're wrong for being unwilling, because, if it's your whole lifestyle or whatever, the Sarah, or I guess the surfer, then it's a big, big ask, right? And maybe that's not something that you want to change or that you can even change, but whatever. They can't change it. They're unwilling to do it, whatever the case may be. They have these. They also often have little consideration for the feelings of other. I kind of mentioned that they might not even be able to kind of put themselves in the shoes of another person. They might have a really difficult time realizing, like, if it doesn't feel bad to me, it shouldn't feel bad to them, which is not the case, not how it works at all. They think I can do what I want, right? They're often very, very independent in an ideological way, right? Almost a fox kind of independent, like I am big and powerful, I can do whatever I want with my body, so I can post all of these pictures. Okay, you can you also not? I mean, whatever. Those aren't things that make someone especially independent more or less, but they often tend to think of it that way. But it's important. They have this idea that, I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever I want. But you can't in a relationship. You can't just do whatever you want. That's what happens in relationships is they limit your freedoms, right? The freedom-security trade-off kind of discussed in one of the earlier papers. And they think it's their problem, they need to fix it. They don't realize that it is an interaction of the behaviors of both partners that lead to the problem in most cases. It's just the other person is crazy, irrational, jealous. It's entirely their problem. They need to fix it. Often they have an idea of psychology and therapy, like they're going to go into therapy and the guy's going to come out and go, I'm no longer jealous. My brain is fixed. You're not going to fix anyone's brain, guys. You're not going to fix their emotions or their jealousy. You guys know how well therapy works for this? I don't think we even have any data on it, except that therapy in general doesn't work great. And I doubt you're going to change the fundamental emotions of people very much. The use of control, we mentioned this. So how is jealousy often expressed in relationships? The jealous partner tries to control the non-jealous partner, right? The person on the other end. It's an evolutionary adaptation, right? This is something that probably would have worked, at least in some points, and probably still does in many cases. Control the other person, keep them away from others. Probably doesn't make your relationship very good. You know, it's not something that you would recommend, right? Just because we say something is evolutionary, that it evolved, that's an adaptation, we're just describing behavior. We're not saying this is the way that it should be, or that it's going to make your relationship good, or that's like a strategy that's even going to work for you. No, none of that. It probably doesn't work that well, in fact. Why? Because the use of control, low relationship satisfaction, you're going to make your partner resent you. You're probably not going to be able to control them, especially if they're kind of wild to begin with. You know, you have this big mismatch to begin with. You can't force anyone to stay, okay? You're going to push them away. You're going to find yourself in that aversive cycle, right? Where you're chasing and they're running and you're pushing and they're getting pushed away. It's just not the way to go. You guys have to, boom, come together, acknowledge each other. You can't control and the other person runs. Control, the other person runs. Yeah, that's not going to work. So the use of control, not a great strategy, but, you know, pretty obvious why people engage in that, right? Pretty obvious why that sort of thing has emerged. So some final thoughts here. Let's look back over this whole Jonah thing and some research on jealousy and all that, see kind of what we got going on. So people are mad because, well, this is my opinion, okay? I think people are mad because they see the demands as being unreasonable. And, you know, I think many people would agree, I kind of agree as well. If you date a surfer and a model and someone involved in that Hollywood culture and all of that, you're going to ask them to change their whole life. You know, they're probably not going to do it. You probably should have known better. But, you know, I'm not going to get mad at it because I see that people do that all the time. They get into relationships with people that are terrible for them. They expect that person to change and they doesn't change and then they break up. Okay, it's extremely common. So people are outraged by what is actually very typical and normal. But it's this unreasonableness, I believe, that enrages people more than ultimatums, demands, or rules, because those are imposed in relationships all the time, right? Everything from you need to stop playing video games so much to you need to stop doing cocaine or whatever the case may be. People always impose demands, rules, and ultimatums in their relationship, one way or the other. They're a feature of relationships. They're not an exception. So people are using kind of saying, because that's another thing that has filtered kind of into pop psychology. It's like ultimatums are bad, you know? And people can use ultimatums in ways that are manipulative, right? They can say, you know, you need to put the gloves on and take the dog out, right? You need to put the gloves on and wash the dog or I'm going to divorce you or whatever the case may be. You do something like that and you're having an extreme ultimatum for a very small behavior and, you know, the person's probably not serious about wanting to break up over it. I don't think that's the case with this Jonah thing. I think, you know, and in fact we saw that they did in the relationship over it. So I think he was quite serious that, you know, that's not the kind of lifestyle that he wants in a partner. So I don't think he was using an ultimatum in a manipulative way. I think he followed through with the ultimatum, in fact, which kind of indicates that it was not, right? That it was a sincere ultimatum in that case. That he said, this is it, and if it can't be met, then the relationship's over, and then the relationship was over, which is something that you might not see when ultimatums are used in manipulative ways, right? You might say, if you don't do this, I'm going to break up with you, and then they don't do it, and they don't break up, and it just continues just as a normal discourse where someone is always threatening the other person. Okay, I think also that men and women in this, they both kind of relate to the different sides based on their own experiences. And, you know, certainly I see a lot of men aligning with Jonah and a lot of women aligning with, I guess, Sarah. And it's not, you know, homogenous. You know, I have a pretty large social media account, so I see a lot of different opinions. It's not like it's all split by sex, but I think people relate to people in these relationships. You know, I think men see Jonah and they think, you know, I probably wouldn't want to date someone that's spending all their time with other men, maybe posting those pictures or whatever. Some men would and some men wouldn't. And at the same time, you know, you see men thinking like, also like, I would like to be able to ask my partner to change and I would like to be able to leave a relationship if they didn't meet those expectations. And then, you know, I think you have women that see it and they think like, they've probably experienced being in a relationship with someone who's controlling at some point. Right? So they probably relate to it that way. They probably think like, I've had someone try to control me and I didn't like it. You know, I've had someone ask me to change and I didn't like it. They probably think like, you know, that the demands are unreasonable and unfair. And they're probably thinking from the context of like, you know, she should be able to have a career. She should be able to have all of these different things, you know, that that historically may have been denied to women in many cases as well. So it's understandable, from these two perspectives, why you kind of see a split by gender, and you could even frame this as expressions kind of different mating strategies, right? Why do women relate to Sarah and men relate to Jonah? It's kind of clear that people form opinions on this not based on logic or based on what, their extensive studies into therapy and abuse and whatever, because most of these are just random people online that have very strong opinions. They're emotional opinions, and they're very understandable, for both sides. So what else do we see here? A lot of social norms that we have, a lot of beliefs about relationships that are popular, that have come to become popular, right? They're probably very incongruent with the emotions and mating behaviors that began to evolve millions of years ago, right? That we see in other animals, right? That are kind of shared among mammals. You have situations like this where people expect what are very, politically correct, very left-wing beliefs about sexuality or something to be normative, right? And then they see people that have more conservative beliefs as being oppressive or non-normative at this point, when in fact those might actually kind of reflect the dispositions that most people have a little bit more on average. So that's another thing, is that looking at things through the lens of politics, ideology, what should be, that's not going to help you understand relationships very much, right? What will help you understand relationships more? Well, understanding people's emotions, the way that they evolved to express those, the different kinds of mating strategies that people have, all of that. Related to that, okay, it's not the patriarchy, guys. The patriarchy is not what causes every negative emotion in men. It's not what causes every conflict in a relationship. I see, this everywhere, just all the time. Everything is reduced to the patriarchy. It's almost like you could have a sort of 6 degrees to the patriarchy, 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon type thing, where if you think about anything long enough, you can turn around and say, oh, I see how the patriarchy caused that. It's funny because people accuse evolutionary psychology of using just so stories. Practically everything that says the patriarchy did this is a just so story, right? There's no way to test it. Very little empirical evidence. Practically no one in psychology is actually operationalizing patriarchy, measuring it, using this as an explanation for anything. It's actually really, really uncommon. It's kind of a socio-political belief. But it's probably not the patriarchy. Why? Well, women experience jealousy similarly to men. There's some research that indicates perhaps even more. Animals do as well. And they engage in kind of the same behaviors as human beings. Mate guarding, right? Jealousy toward offspring that's not their own. All of that. So yeah, I don't know if the patriarchy arose millions of years ago with the animals, and if the birds have a patriarchy, and the apes and the chimpanzees or whatever. This even occurs in what have been called egalitarian primates like bonobos, right? They still get jealous. They still have conflicts over these sorts of things. So what can be said about that? What else? People don't stop being jealous easily, right? There's a popular perception, that go to therapy and fix it or whatever. It's not going to happen. I would throw that out the window immediately, especially if you are on the receiving end of jealousy, right? And you think, oh, my partner needs to go to fix his jealousy. You take him to therapy, couples therapy. You're probably going to be really disappointed that they don't just say, oh yeah, he's the problem and you need to fix it. You might be surprised if they say you need to change some things actually to make them less jealous. But people don't stop being jealous easily. You can go to therapy for that. You're probably not going to change very much. Why? It's a stable personality feature that some people are much more jealous than others. It's heritable, right? It's genetic. It doesn't change easily. Most personality features, not receptive at all to therapy, okay? Many of these relationships, that some of the statistics I read going through these therapy-based papers on jealousy, most of these relationships end. They don't make it. You get into therapy for jealousy, forget it, it's over. It's something that has to be caught at the beginning. And it doesn't mean that couples who are pretty jealous can't actually do really well. They can, and there's some indication, for example, that two people with anxious attachment, because they are anxious and they do get kind of jealous, they lean on each other a lot, right? They come together and like little birds and they actually do really well. So it's not always the case that even like being really jealous is a problem. But yeah, by the time you have people going to therapy for it, it has become a large problem, and it usually doesn't reverse especially well. So That also means that, like work on your jealousy, sweetie. It's much less realistic than modifying jealousy-inducing behaviors. And yeah, again, I'm not going to say, you have to stop doing everything so your partner doesn't get jealous, right? That's not realistic, or even a relationship that person would want to be in. But it is important that people look at kind of their own behaviors. Are they engaging in things that are unnecessary that may be evoking jealousy? What else? It might also just mean finding someone who doesn't make you jealous. If you are the jealous person, right? If you're with someone and they're making you unreasonably jealous, and you sincerely believe like, this person is really doing things I find inappropriate, making me really, really jealous, you should leave, right? You probably shouldn't try to control them, right? You probably shouldn't expect them to change all of their behaviors that are upsetting you, just like they should not expect you to change your brain, right? They shouldn't expect you to change your entire emotional landscape and just like, oh, I was jealous and now I'm completely open to polyamorous relationship. Not really going to work either. The best thing might be simply to find someone that doesn't make you extremely jealous. What else? These attitudes that come up, you're not allowed to ask me to do that. You're not allowed to leave me. Very idealistic. This is a very normal feature of relationships. However, people will ask you to make changes in relationships all of the time, and they're not always going to be like large changes. They're not always going to be unreasonable changes. They're not always going to be things like you have to quit your job and stop speaking to friends and whatever. Again, I'm not trying to relate this all to that situation or talking more about more reasonable people here perhaps. But this is a normal feature of relationships. People will ask you to do things. They're allowed to ask you to do things. They're allowed to tell you, like, if my needs are not met, I'm going to break up with you. Whatever. They will ask you to make changes in a relationship. And you can be mad about that if you want to. You can be very upset about that. You can share online the tweets or the texts that they sent you that say, look, he asked me to make these changes that I found unreasonable. And you might get a lot of people that agree with you and share your rage. But that won't actually fix anything in your relationship, will it? This was someone that was still upset 2 years after the breakup, Most people are completely back to baseline at 3 months, right? And the average, I think, is even a little bit earlier than that. So you have someone that really hung on to this breakup for a long, long time, and being mad about it, yeah, not going to help you. What will help you? Well, teaching people to say no. Teaching people that when they are given an ultimatum that they can say no if it's extremely unreasonable. And the onus is entirely on them. It's not on the other person not to ask. People are going to ask you. You cannot control the other people. And that's very important in therapy and psychology. It focuses on individuals, on what you can do for yourself, personal accountability in a sense. You can change your own mental landscape and behavior, the other person, not so much. So you must learn to say no if you are given unreasonable demands in a relationship. You can't just expect like, oh, it's unfair for them to ask me. Yeah, well, whatever. They've asked you now. Now what do you do? Are you going to give everything up, or are you going to say no when you want to? It's also important to understand that just like people can ask very unreasonable demands, they can be very controlling, and that can lead into something that begins to look a lot like abuse. If everyone in your life has been insane, jealous, control freak, it might not actually be everyone else, right? It's probably you in that case. And that's something else that people don't discuss, that they don't want to hear, and that I mentioned in a previous slide, is that a lot of the time when people get jealous, they have good reasons to be jealous, right? It's not entirely irrational. It might be exaggerated, but it's often not entirely irrational. There's often is some kind of behavior going on that's upsetting them, right? And if it's a very minor behavior and they're extremely jealous, then you have encountered someone who's an outlier, actually. You've encountered an exception. But if you encounter someone who's extremely jealous in all of your relationships, and you think your behavior is really, really minor, how likely is it that you've dated an outlier all of those times? Not very likely. And you could be selecting people who are very jealous, right? Because mate assortment, it's not random, right? You could have preferences for people who do actually have a high level of jealousy. And we see that in abuse, for example, that people who are victims of abuse are much more likely to be serial victims of abuse, right? They select partners like that. But in the case of jealousy here, you know, apart from the potential that you are selecting extremely jealous people repeatedly, it could also be that you're simply engaging in behavior that makes most people jealous rationally, and that you don't want to hear it, right? And that you are like, no, I'm perfect. I'm doing nothing wrong. You know, I'm allowed to be on OnlyFans, and if people don't like that, then you know, they can kick rocks. Okay, yeah, but a lot of people are going to be jealous about that. It's not unreasonable. So Jonah's demands, you know, they were pretty strict. They were probably very unreasonable to comply with. I don't think most people would. I don't think most people would be able to, and I think that is really what upset a lot of people. You know, like give up your career and your life and stop having friends. Okay, it's too far. It's way out there. But that's not the case in most of these jealousy cases, right? It's not usually people becoming jealous because, and trying to take everything away. You know, that happens, right? Emotional abuse, control, that sort of a thing. But a lot of the time people just don't want to be told no to simple transgressions that make other people feel bad. So that's also something to consider, that if this has been a repeat pattern in your life where you have dated men or women who are controlling and jealous all of the time, you know, might be worthwhile to look at your own behavior and think like, you know, are there a few things that I have done as well? Anyway, end of the video, guys. Hope you liked it. I will make another for you very soon.